Night had settled over the Pacific, thick and heavy, like a shroud. The sand still carried the sharp scent of cordite and rain, a lingering reminder of battles fought and lost. Beyond the dunes, a flare hissed upward, bursting into red light that painted the wreckage of a field hospital in eerie hues. A line of Japanese nurses, barefoot and exhausted, their uniforms torn, shuffled through the mud as American boots approached with a steady, crushing rhythm. One Marine barked, "No talking." His voice cut through the wind, sharp as steel. The war was over for them, but their hearts hadn't caught up. They were no longer women, no longer nurses, just numbers scrawled in chalk across their sleeves. Under the flickering glow of a lantern, they were lined up one by one, each handed a meaningless scrap of paper. A young nurse, barely 20, blinked hard to hold back her tears. Her number was 18. Reports from the final months of 1945 would later reveal that more than 400 Japanese women were captured across the Pacific Islands, most of them medics, clerks, or field nurses. None had been trained to fight. Yet here, beneath a dripping canvas sky, they were treated like enemy soldiers. A sergeant walked past with a clipboard, eyes scanning numbers, not faces. The women whispered among themselves, wondering if they'd be sent home or to someplace worse. Their breath curled in the cold air. From a distance, a truck idled, its headlights sweeping across their faces like a slow, searching question. One nurse heard someone sob behind her. A voice, trembling, whispered in Japanese, "We are not soldiers." But no one answered. The chalk mark on her arm began to smear with sweat. She wanted to wipe it off, but the guard watched too closely. Then, another officer approached, holding a small bundle of metal in his fist. The faint jingle of it broke the silenced dog tags, American ones. Each one gleamed under the lantern, stamped with the name of a dead man, his blood type, his faith. The sergeant dropped them on a table, one by one. "Tomorrow," he said flatly, "you'll wear these." The women exchanged glances, confusion giving way to dread. The nurse stared at the tags, realizing they weren't just pieces of metal. They were identities torn from men whose bodies had barely cooled. And so, the humiliation began not with a shout, but with an order. The next morning dawned gray and silent. The sea reeked of oil and rust. Gulls circled low over the camp, their cries sharp against the stillness. Nurse number 18 stood in line again, her hands trembling behind her back. The same sergeant from the night before marched toward the table, a wooden crate under his arm. When he opened it, the sound of metal clinking filled the air, hundreds of dog tags catching the weak sunlight. Each one bore the name of a dead Marine, his blood type, religion, serial number. The sergeant's voice was flat. "Each of you will wear one. Around the neck, always visible." The women looked at each other, unsure if they'd misheard the translator, until he repeated it in Japanese, slowly, clearly. The meaning struck like a physical blow. A tag was tossed toward the nurse. It spun in the air before landing in her palm, cold, heavy, American. The name read times J, Donnelly USMC *. She didn't know who he was, but the scratches on the tag told her he hadn't died easily. Archives from the Pacific War would later note that dog tags were treated as sacred, never removed, never defiled. They carried a man's entire identity on 2 inches of stamped steel. And now, these women, once healers, once nurses, were ordered to wear them like collars. One Marine chuckled under his breath. Another muttered, "Fair trade." The interpreter avoided their eyes. The nurse hesitated. The sergeant stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Do it!" Her fingers fumbled with the chain, looping it around her neck. The metal touched her skin, shockingly cold, like the sea after a battle. Around her, The others did the same, 100 tags clinking together in a cruel, metallic chorus. She wondered if Donnelly's family would ever know that across the ocean, his name now hung from a Japanese woman's chest. The thought made her dizzy. She gripped the tag until her knuckles turned white. Later, when the guards had left, one woman whispered, "It feels like wearing his ghost." The nurse didn't answer. She just stared at the engraved letters, realizing she'd been given not freedom, but someone else's death. That night, they were lined up again for inspection. Every tag was checked, every rule enforced. But for now, the sound of metal filled the air, proof that the war hadn't truly ended inside anyone. The sun climbed higher, bleaching everything to the color of bone. A whistle pierced the camp. Inspection time. The women, now silent shadows, formed a line outside the barracks. Their dog tags glinted like tiny knives against their chests. Dust swirled around their bare ankles as guards barked orders. An American lieutenant paced the row, clipboard in hand. He stopped at each woman, gripping the tag between two fingers, checking the name, the chain, the position. No words, just the scratch of pen on paper. For the nurse wearing Donnelly's tag, each touch felt like an invasion. She could smell the soap on the officer's hands, clean and sharp, so foreign. He lifted her tag, studied it, and nodded. She exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was surrender. Archival records from the U.S. War Department confirmed that over 1,000 photographs of captured personnel were taken for documentation. The lens didn't care about dignity. It wanted order. In those images, they stood perfectly still, proof that control had replaced chaos. A camera flashed. The nurse flinched. The burst of light burned through her closed eyelids. For a moment, she imagined Donnelly himself, staring back through that lens, wondering why a stranger now wore his name. Behind her, a guard muttered, "Looks good. Keep them in line." The lieutenant moved on, checking another tag, another face. Every click of his clipboard sounded like a lock turning. When the inspection ended, the sergeant reminded them, "Keep the tags visible at all times. Anyone found without one discipline." His voice echoed off the corrugated metal walls, leaving a chill heavier than the heat. That night, the nurse lay awake on her cot, the tag resting against her throat, swaying faintly with each breath. The air smelled of sweat and kerosene. Around her, the others whispered prayers, the names of men they'd never known, now forced to wear like curses. She turned her head and saw dozens of tiny reflections of the moon on steel, an army of borrowed souls. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. The tag tapped softly against her collarbone. Asterisk, tap, 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 asterisk. Like a ghost reminding her that identity wasn't something you could take off. And in the darkness, the sound became a whisper that followed her into the night. Night again. The camp had gone quiet, except for the distant hum of a generator and the restless murmurs of women who couldn't sleep. Inside the barracks, shadows stretched long across the walls. The nurse, still wearing Donnelly's tag, lay on her cot, eyes open, watching the rafters tremble in the wind. The tag moved when she breathed. Asterisk. Click. Clink. Asterisk. Every sound felt amplified in the dark. The chain caught her hair. She tried to ignore it, but the metal had become part of her skin, an unwanted heartbeat that wouldn't stop. From the bunk beside her, a whisper. "What was your man's name?" She hesitated, then answered softly, "J. Donnelly." The name felt strange in her mouth, heavy and foreign. The others whispered their own Harris, Cole, Thompson, as if reciting a roll call of ghosts. Reports would later suggest that by the final winter of 1945, Most Pacific POW camps rationed less than 2,000 calories per day. The women slept cold, hungry, wearing the names of men who had died with full bellies. A sudden gust slammed the tin door. The dog tags jingled a chorus of lost identities rattling in the dark. The nurse gripped hers tightly, trying to still it, but the motion only made it louder. She wondered if the Marines outside could hear them, the metallic whispers of the enemy they'd tried to erase. One woman began humming an old Japanese lullaby, but the tune faltered, drowned by the clicking steel. The nurse turned the tag over in her fingers, imagining Donnelly's face. Was he kind? Did he hate her? Was he even real? The engraving felt too sharp to belong to someone soft. Outside, boots crunched closer. A flashlight beam cut through the cracks in the wood. "Quiet in there!" a guard shouted. The room froze. The women held their breath until the light disappeared. Then, the whisper of metal returned. Softer, slower, like waves retreating after a storm. The nurse pressed the tag flat against her skin, the chill biting through her thin shirt. Asterisk. His name is cold. Asterisk, she thought. Asterisk, colder than the air. The door slammed open so hard the hinges groaned. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, landing on the nurse's face. She jerked upright, half blinded. The guard stepped inside, boots thudding on the wooden floor, his breath sharp with tobacco. "Who was talking?" he growled. No one answered. The only sound was the faint metallic rattle as every woman instinctively gripped her dog tag. The light stopped on her. The guard squinted. "Why isn't your tag showing?" Her fingers flew to her neck. The chain had slipped under her collar while she slept. She tried to explain, but the words died in her throat. The guard yanked the tag into view and studied it. Asterisk. J. Donnelly. Asterisk. He read it slowly, then looked her in the eyes. "You trying to forget him?" Reports showed that in 1944, U.S. Army Regulation 20-8 stated that every prisoner of war must display visible identification at all times. To them, this wasn't cruelty. It was order. But order could strip a person faster than violence ever could. The nurse whispered, "I did not remove it." The interpreter repeated her words, but the sergeant just shook his head. "Rules are rules." His tone was dry, mechanical, like reciting scripture. He made her stand, hands behind her back. The flashlight's glare made the tag gleam like a brand. Around her, the other women stayed frozen, silent, small. The guard checked the rest of the room, barking orders for everyone to keep their tags outside their shirts. The metallic clinking resumed, louder now, like a rain of steel. When he finally left, the door slammed again, plunging them back into darkness. The nurse sat down, her heart hammering. She could still hear his voice. Asterisk. Rules are rules. Asterisk. The phrase looped in her mind, hollow but sharp, echoing against the memory of Donnelly's engraved name. For the first time, she realized these men didn't see them as women or even enemies. They saw them as symbols to be disciplined, and every tag was a leash. Dawn seeped through the cracks in the barrack walls, but it brought no warmth, only the buzzing of flies and the smell of ink. Inside the camp office, everything felt unnaturally clean. Papers were stacked in neat rows, typewriter keys clacking like gunfire. The nurse stood at attention, her tag dangling just above the edge of the desk. Behind it sat an American lieutenant, his uniform pressed, his expression unreadable. The interpreter beside him flipped through a small dictionary, searching for words sharp enough to translate humiliation. The sergeant from the night before leaned against the wall, arms folded, watching like a man ensuring order was served cold. "State your name," the officer said. The interpreter hesitated, then answered for her. "Number 18, sir." The lieutenant frowned. "No, Her name. The interpreter repeated the question in Japanese. She swallowed hard and whispered it. Her real name felt fragile, like something that might break if spoken too loudly. The officer nodded and began typing. Each clack of the keys seemed to nail her identity further into someone else's file. Reports showed that during 1945, every POW record was duplicated 3 times, one for the camp, one for the War Department, one for the Red Cross. Paper trails more durable than memory. The officer slid a form across the desk. Sign here. She stared at it. On the top line, her name, but beneath it, stamped in neat black ink, was Times J. Donnelly, USMC. Serial number 05711 asterisk. The same serial number was now assigned to her. The interpreter didn't look up as he said, "It is for record, for discipline." Her hand trembled as she signed. The pen scratched her name beneath a dead man's number. Outside, a jeep backfired. She jumped, spilling a drop of ink across the paper. The officer sighed, marked it completed, and filed it away. Just another name, another box checked. The sergeant gestured toward the door. "Laundry duty," he said. "You can think there." The nurse stepped into the heat, the tag still cold on her skin. Behind her, the typewriter started again, hammering away like it was writing history in real time. Steam curled through the open flap of the laundry tent, thick with the sting of soap and rust. The nurse, still marked as Times J. Donnelly asterisk, rolled up her sleeves and plunged her hands into a tub of gray water. The warmth stung her skin. Around her, the other women worked in silence, their chains clinking faintly beneath the hiss of boiling water. The rhythm of scrubbing filled the aircloth against metal basins, water sloshing like slow drums. It almost sounded like music until you listened closer and realized it was exhaustion, wearing a rhythm. A corporal entered, clipboard under his arm, checking the laundry count. Reports indicated that a single POW camp processed over 600 uniforms per week, using nearly 90 gallons of water each cycle. For the prisoners, this wasn't labor. It was routine punishment, disguised as order. The corporal didn't speak. He just inspected the soap, the slicked uniforms, nodded, and left. The nurse exhaled, wiping her brow. The chain around her neck slipped forward, the tag tapping the edge of the metal basin. Asterisk. Click. Asterisk. She stared at it, at the name stamped deep enough to outlast skin. "Whose name?" the woman beside her whispered. The nurse hesitated. "Donnelly." The other woman nodded slowly, as if she too carried someone she'd never met. "Mine," she murmured, "is Thompson." And then something quiet happened. Each woman began speaking softly, reciting the names around their necks. One by one, foreign syllables rippled through the tent. Harris, Cole, Bennett, Andrews. It was like a roll call for ghosts. The names swirled in the steam, rising with the scent of soap and sweat. The nurse dipped a shirt into the basin. The water turned cloudy, foam circling like memory, refusing to settle. She thought of Donnelly's family, maybe somewhere in Chicago or Boston, receiving a letter marked Times missing in action. Asterisk. Did they know that his tag still breathed here, on an island they'd never see? The sound of a camera shutter broke the moment. A guard had entered, snapping a photo through the tent's opening. "For records," he muttered. The women froze mid-motion, eyes down. The nurse kept her hands submerged, as if hiding the name beneath the water would somehow make it hers again. But the guard grinned, already planning the next step. A photograph session. Tomorrow, the world would see the Times tag girls. Asterisk. The next morning smelled of wet canvas and tension. A sign had been nailed to the laundry tent. Asterisk inspection and photo. All personnel. Asterisk. The women stood outside in a row, uniforms damp from washing, dog tags polished to a dull gleam. The nurse clutched hers nervously, the chain biting into her neck. A U.S. Army photographer set up a bulky speed graphic camera on a tripod. The black hood flapped like a vulture's wing in the wind. A corporal beside him checked the angle. "Make sure the tags show," he said, voice casual but cold. The women obeyed. One by one, they straightened their posture, holding still beneath the glare of the late morning Sunday. The nurse could feel sweat sliding down her spine, pooling under the chain. The tag against her chest felt heavier than any weapon she'd ever seen. Historical reports showed that the U.S. Signal Corps captured over 80,000 wartime images across the Pacific, each stamped for documentation. Faces became data, pain became proof. "Look here," the photographer called. The shutter clicked. Flash powder flared white. The nurse blinked, seeing stars. Another click, another burst. Each one felt like being erased more precisely. A woman down the line flinched, turning her head away. The sergeant barked, "Face forward." When she hesitated, he slapped her hard across the cheek. The crack echoed through the camp. Nobody moved. The photographer paused for a second, then kept shooting. For a moment, the nurse's eyes locked with the lens. She wondered if the man behind it understood what he was capturing. 100 women forced to wear the names of men who'd killed theirs. But the lens didn't care. It only saw contrast, composition, control. When the session ended, the photographer lowered the camera and muttered, "History needs proof." Then he walked away. The women stood there, blinded by light, their humiliation now sealed on film that would outlast all of them. The night draped over the camp like heavy cloth. The generator had gone silent, leaving only the faint hiss of the sea and the restless shifting of women on wooden bunks. The nurse clutched the small Bible to her chest, unable to sleep. The dog tag rested against the thin pages, a weight she couldn't shake off. At some point, she drifted into dreams. Smoke filled the air. She was standing on a beach littered with helmets, boots, and names. The horizon burned red. A voice behind her called out, "Private Donnelly!" She turned, but there was no one there. Only waves foaming around her ankles, carrying more dog tags ashore like silver fish. She looked down. Her hands were covered in sand and blood. She screamed her own name, but the sound that came out was his. Asterisk, J. Donnelly. Asterisk, again and again, each time louder. She jolted awake, breath ragged, heart racing. For a second, she couldn't tell which name still echoed inside her chest. Post-war psychiatric reports estimated that nearly 45% of female POWs suffered lasting trauma night terrors, auditory echoes, dissociative guilt, the mind's way of trying to return to a self it no longer recognized. The nurse pressed her palms to her ears, whispering, "It's not me. It's not me." But the tags swung forward, clicking softly against the Bible as if answering back. She gripped the chain, yanking it hard enough to bruise her neck. The metal felt hot, unnaturally so. She gasped and dropped it, staring as if it were alive. "Stop!" she muttered. "Stop following me." From the cot beside her, another woman stirred. "Bad dream?" she whispered. The nurse nodded. "He was calling me." The other woman didn't ask who. They both knew there were names in this camp that didn't belong to the living anymore. The storm hadn't stopped. Sheets of rain hammered the tin roofs, drowning every other sound in the camp. The nurse moved quietly through the darkness, clutching the chain in her fist. Around her, the others pretended to sleep, eyes half open, breaths held. They'd learned that rebellion began in whispers, not shouts. She slipped out through the side flap of the barracks. Cold air slapped her face. The world smelled of mud and diesel. In the corner of the yard, a rusted barrel burned low, flames licking wet wood. Guards used it to warm their hands at night. Now, it would serve another purpose. The tag dangled from her palm, catching glints of firelight. Asterisk J. Donnelly. Asterisk. The name that had lived against her skin for weeks. The nurse stared at it, lips trembling. Then she whispered something too soft to be heard and dropped it in. The metal hit the coals with a hiss, like a dying breath. For a moment, the chain twisted and curled, glowing red. The letters melted into shapelessness, identity liquefying into heat and smoke. She didn't move until the fire flickered low again. Reports from Pacific POW archives recorded 14 documented incidents of insubordination among female prisoners between 1,944 and 1,945. Each was punished swiftly, often cruelly. She knew the risk. Still, for the first time, she felt something fierce flicker in her chest. Not victory, just reclamation. Then a shout sliced through the rain. "Hey, what are you doing?" A guard ran toward her, boots splashing mud. She flinched back as he yanked her by the arm, dragging her away from the fire. The barrel tipped, sparks scattering across the puddled ground. He cursed, dousing it with a bucket of water. Steam erupted, thick, white, furious. "The tag!" he yelled. "Where's the tag?" She said nothing. Smoke clung to her hair, her clothes, her skin. Somewhere, under the hissing water, the tag lay melted, unrecognizable. The officer arrived minutes later, eyes blazing. "Put her in isolation," he snapped. She burned government property. They dragged her toward a concrete cell at the edge of camp. Rain pelted her face like needles, but she was smiling barely, faintly, as if the fire still burned somewhere inside her ribs, because for the first time, she was no longer wearing anyone's name. The cell was smaller than a storeroom concrete walls, sweating moisture. No window, only a rusted vent that sighed with every gust of wind. The nurse sat on the floor, knees to her chest, wrists raw from the rough handling. They'd taken everything from her now, shoes, blanket, even the tiny Bible. But, without the tag, her neck felt light for the first time. The absence was shocking, almost holy. She touched the empty space where the chain used to hang and let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Reports described isolation cells in Pacific POW camps as 6 by 8 feet, barely enough space to lie flat. Prisoners were given 1 meal a day, a tin cup of rice, a ladle of watery stew. It wasn't meant to feed the body, it was meant to erase the spirit. A guard slid a bowl through the slot. The spoon inside clinked against metal, and for a moment, that small sound ripped through her nerves. She stared at it, remembering the tag's faint rhythm against her collarbone, asterisk, click, clink, asterisk. But this was different. This was silence, pretending to have shape. Hours blurred, light never changed. She started counting her breaths, whispering her name after every 10th one, terrified she might forget it. The sound was small but defiant, echoing off the stone. Asterisk, my name is mine. Asterisk, she murmured. Asterisk, only mine. Asterisk. One night bled into the next. Her reflection stared back at her from a puddle near the wall. Hair tangled, lips cracked, eyes brighter than they should be. She lifted her finger and wrote her name on the damp concrete, each stroke trembling but sure. Letters forming out of willpower, not ink. When the guards finally opened the door, the first thing they saw was that name etched faintly on the wall. They shouted, "Order her up! Drag her into daylight!" She squinted, nearly blinded. The world outside felt too wide after so many hours pressed into walls. A Red Cross vehicle waited near the gate, its white emblem glaring against the mud. The war inspectors had arrived for a surprise review. Guards scrambled to hide what the storm of shame had left behind. And in that chaos, her small act of defiance, the burned tag, the name on the wall, would meet the eyes of someone who still remembered what rules were supposed to mean. Late morning sunlight cut through the camp's wire fences as two jeeps rolled in, each marked with the Red Cross on white. The guards snapped to attention, their nervous movements betraying their fear of inspection. The officers stepped out, one American, one Swiss clipboards in hand, expressions carved from discipline. The nurse was marched from isolation, thin and pale, her bare feet leaving faint prints in the mud. Her eyes blinked against the light. She wasn't wearing a tag anymore, and that more than her silence made the guards uneasy. The Swiss officer gestured for the interpreter. "Why, no identification tag?" The interpreter hesitated. It was lost in fire. The officer wrote something down. His pen moved quickly, precise. Behind him, a photographer raised a small camera, capturing everything: the tents, the faces, the women lined up like faded ghosts. The shutter clicked softly, the sound of accountability trying to keep up with shame. Records from 1945 showed the Geneva Convention Article 12 required humane treatment of prisoners, protection from insults, and respect for personal dignity. In practice, those words often stayed ink on paper, rules recited, not remembered. The American inspector stepped closer to the nurse. "Your condition?" he asked. The interpreter translated. She answered quietly in Japanese. "I am alive." He nodded, then noticed the faint mark on her neck, the pale ring where the tag once hung. His jaw tightened. He looked at the guards but said nothing. The silence between their uniforms felt louder than gunfire. The officers moved on, taking notes, measuring rations, counting blankets. Every tick of their pens tried to make order out of cruelty. The nurse stood still, her name, the one she'd carved on the wall, burning like a secret under her breath. As the inspection ended, the Swiss officer turned once more. His gaze lingered on her, just long enough for her to believe he understood, but he wrote nothing about the tag. Years later, rain tapped against glass, traffic humming far below. The nurse stood in a quiet museum hall, now an old woman wrapped in a dark wool coat. Her hair was silver, her posture still straight, her eyes sharp as ever. Before her, inside a glass display case, lay something small and familiar. A corroded dog tag, its chain curled like a question mark. The label beneath it read, Asterisk, recovered artifact, Okinawa, 1945. Asterisk. She leaned closer. The letters were faint, but still legible. Asterisk J. Donnelly, U.S.M.C. Asterisk, the same name, the same ghost. The tag she'd thought had melted into nothing had somehow survived. Dug up decades later, repatriated across oceans, turned into history again. Reports confirmed that more than 100 personal effects were returned to Japan between 1,950 and 1,970 photographs, diaries, identification tags. The tag she'd thought had melted into nothing had somehow survived. Dug up decades later, repatriated across oceans, turned into history again. Reports confirmed that more than 100 personal effects were returned to Japan between 1,950 and 1,970 photographs, diaries, identification tags. The war had ended, but its echoes kept washing back ashore. Her reflection hovered over the glass, overlapping with Donnelly's name. For a heartbeat, they looked like one person again. She remembered the smell of rain in the camp, the taste of metal in her mouth, the way the tag had burned against her skin before she threw it into the fire. And she realized something. She hadn't destroyed it to forget him. She destroyed it to remember herself. Behind her, a young curator explained softly to visitors in English. These artifacts show the humanity on both sides. They tell us war is not about soldiers, it's about names. The words hung in the air like smoke, delicate but true. The old nurse took a slow breath and reached into her coat pocket. From it, she pulled out another tag, one she'd made years after the war. It was lighter, cleaner, engraved with her own name in Japanese and English. She placed it beside Donnelly's glass case, resting it gently on the exhibit ledge. "Now," she whispered, "we're even." She turned to leave, her reflection fading from the glass, leaving only two tags side by side, one of death, one of survival. Outside, the city hummed, a world rebuilt, unaware of the ghosts still hanging from invisible chains. She stepped into the drizzle, her own tag warm against her skin, proof that identity can be stolen, burned, rewritten, and still return home.